non-doership. So this is a very dicey part of non-duality, and it can be difficult to talk about because the interpretation of what's being talked about can be self-defeating for the listener. What I mean by self-defeating is that often people that hear non-doership interpret it in the wrong way and make it something about them that the person can't do. So let's start at the very beginning from non-duality. So what is non-duality? Non-duality means not to. So non-divided, not a divided reality, not to. In Western cultures, or in most cultures, even in Eastern cultures, people have the assumption that they are somebody experiencing the world, that they're somebody in relationship to the world. And then from that assumption, they tell a story about themselves. So they believe that they're somebody that was born on a certain date, has certain friends, has a certain status in societies, from a particular country. And they begin to make up a whole story about who they are, where they're going, what they're going to be, what they need to be in order to be happy, what sort of world they live in. They have all these stories about themselves. Whereas if we look at animals, I know this is hard to imagine because in the human world, most people are only used to imagining themselves, but in the animal world, they don't have a sense of self. If we took like a dog, for example, a dog can't recognize itself in the mirror, and the dog can't speak, the dog can't communicate to other dogs. It can't think like we can think. It has some form of thinking, but it can't think like, I'm going to go to the shops today, because it doesn't have the language to think about that. It might have some form of imagery, but in terms of words, it can't put itself into subject-object because it doesn't speak or think. So how is a dog functioning? So you know when you drive a car, like that you just drive the car and it happens automatically. You don't have to think like, touch the gear stick now, whichever side it's on, to the steering wheel, put my foot on the gas, pick up my drink and have a drink. It's just a happening. The body is just doing it, and there's nobody doing it. It's just happening. It's the same when you're riding a bike, or maybe if you're doing art and you're creating art, there's no one that's doing it. You could say the body's on automatic, or it's driving itself. Whatever you say, it doesn't really matter. But that's how a dog is functioning, is the dog is simply responding to what's happening, and there's nobody interfering with it. So there's no intelligent reflection about the way they've behaved or the way they could behave. They're just responding to the situations that arise, just like when you're driving a car. So the human has this complicated capacity to reflect on themselves. So the human can actually imagine itself driving the car. So it can be driving, say in LA, let's do LA as an example, because LA to me is really shocking when you drive around with all the cars. If you've ever been to LA and you're not from LA, you'll know what I mean. If you're from LA, it'll just be normal. But so what we can do as humans, so when the dog's in the car, it's just in the car, whereas the human can be in the car and it's just driving, and then suddenly a big Porsche pulls up beside you, and then suddenly you can imagine yourself sitting in your car and what you look like in comparison to them, whether you're as good as the other person, or maybe you're attracted to the other person, so there can be an adjustment of your hair, and you imagine yourself, and you know who you are, and you know you're in your car, and you know you're looking at this other car. Or say you could be another person in LA that's got like, I don't know, what's the best car there is in the world, like a Lexa, is that what it's called? I don't know. So you could have like the best car in the world, and say you pull up at the traffic lights and you see other people in relatively good cars, but you realize yours is the best. So then there could be like, there could be like a big sense of pride that arises. And that's the difference, I presume, between animals and dogs. I can't say for sure, but that's what I presume. I live with a dog. I asked God for a child and I got a hairy dog, and then I was like, okay, I'll take it as the child. So I live with a dog, and I don't think that she's got any self-awareness. So everything she does, she's 100% in it, and she doesn't know herself from that which she's in contact with. Just like when you're driving and you've got no self-awareness, when it's just a happening, like you have no sense of who you are or what you're doing, it's just a happening. There's just driving, or you're just cycling on the bike, and there's just cycling, or you're painting and there's just cycling, and there's no middle man, middle woman, it's just a happening, or middle non-binary person. It's just a happening. And that's the primary difference. It's actually because of the identification with that self-awareness and that story that's telling you that you're this person, that you've got choice, that you've got free will, and it limits you and you become inside the body. Whereas the animals are just free, they just are what they are. And if you notice when you're driving the car or when you're doing something and you're really involved in it, like you're just responding, and there's no control of yourself. You're not thinking, I did well, I did badly, you're just doing it. There's just action happening. And in the action, there might be an energetic separation, but even in that, it kind of dissolves. Even if you haven't had an energetic shift, there's kind of a dissolving in it. So you can get a sense of what I mean, that that separation comes from identifying with that self-awareness and that story of you, that personal story of you. So suffering comes from that, this identification, and there's nothing inherently wrong with self-awareness and that thinking. But this identification is the problem, and this identification creates a feeling of discomfort because it's not true. It's not true that you're a limitation inside your body. Who you are is everything. It's life, it's happening. So if you go back to driving the car again, that like you have, when you're totally lost in it, you have no awareness of you. So there's no difference between you and the handlebars, or you and that which is outside. It's just a happening. And this limitation always makes you feel uncomfortable. It makes you feel like you've lost something, because you have. Rather than being totally immersed in the experience, you're removed from the experience, telling your story of the experience. And then you could call that an illusion, like, because that's not actually what's happening. That's your interpretation of what's happening. And again, there's nothing wrong with the interpretation of what's happening, as long as there's not an identification with that and a belief that that's true, that your interpretation is the way things are, and not knowing the difference between what's happening and what you think is happening. When years ago, I did a talk at my mum's carers group, and I always remember this, because I realized then that people didn't know they thought. So if they thought this person's I didn't have a memory of just believing that thoughts were fact, not even being able to reflect and say, I was thinking about that. Just thinking that if you don't like someone, that's a fact. It's not a thought, it's not a projection, it's a fact. You don't like someone, the sky is blue, the tree is green, that these are facts, where there's nothing that is fact. Everything that you say in words is always a description pointing to something, but can't actually talk about it. So non-duality is the expression of coming back to who you truly are, what you truly are, which is this moment, which is what is. And that's a real celebration. That's all that anybody's ever wanted. It doesn't mean that there needs to be self-awareness that disappears or thoughts that disappear. It's this energetic sticking to it, that is who I am, when who you are is much broader. And that character can carry on inside the body-mind mechanism, so there can still be an interpretation of events, and there still can be feelings and judgments and emotional reactions and the appearance of choice, but it's no longer the identification with that being truth and that being the way it is. It's seen as a functioning that's happening in this. And that's the end of seeking when that happens. There's no longer a seeking for freedom in time. Because when you are identified with that character, you always feel uncomfortable, and what the person does is the only thing it can do, it seeks in pleasure and tries to avoid pain, and believes that one day it will arrive at happiness in the future, or arrive at freedom in the future, or arrive at completion in the future. And that's seeking, this idea that something in the future is going to save you, where really the savior, what you're looking for, is what's already happening. It is what is. And it's not so much about this character, so this self-awareness and this story of you becoming present. Like, it's not that that has to come present. It's an energetic shift from being that to everything. In the process of awakening, the person, in order to still itself, in order to lose its neurosis, because when there's an identification with that person, there's lots of neurosis that can form. In order to lose that, there can be practices that manifest and an exploration that manifests in order to break that down. So there can be that personal awareness, and that one that's always telling the story puts effort into putting the attention in I am or in consciousness. It could also be that person explores its emotions and explores why it does things and what it actually wants, explores its relationships, its psychology, its energetic body. And that normally happens when people are awakening or people get into this subject, that there's an exploration, like a whole body mind exploration. And that normally goes hand in hand, but actually it's not that person that's doing those practices that wake up, although there's nothing wrong with doing them, and more than likely it makes you a more healthy, balanced, integrated individual. But it's not that person that wakes up, because that person doesn't actually exist. That poor person is thoughts and ideas and energies arising now, giving the appearance that somebody's sitting here looking out. We get into the weird stuff of non-duality, going for it. So you most probably assume, like I used to assume, that you are somebody with free will inside the body, and that you've arrived in this room and you're sitting here out of your free will and choice as a separate individual watching me speak. Whereas actually, well, that's not actually true. There isn't actually a body here and there isn't a body there. There isn't some body sitting there. There is ideas and feelings that appear reporting back that somebody's sitting there. But all of that is in knowledge and in intellect. And that can't be who you are, because firstly, knowledge comes and goes. So when you were a baby, you didn't have very much knowledge, and as you get older, you more than likely lose your knowledge. And also, when you hit your head, you forget all your knowledge if you get concussion. So that can't actually be who you are, because knowledge is something that comes and goes. Thoughts about yourself, memories about yourself is actually something that comes and goes. So that's not who's actually experiencing now, because it's something that's in flux, it's something that's changing and evolving. So that can't be the experiencer. Secondly, every thought that appears about you, every idea, every feeling is being experienced, which is really profound if you think about it. So everything that you know about yourself, that you arrived in this room, that you're leaving this room, that that you have children, that you like the color pink, whatever it may be, really begin to investigate, you'll notice that everything that you identify with as you is a thought or a feeling, and there's something that experiences that. Then they're not the experiencer. Most people think that that gets sucked into a soul inside, and that that's married to consciousness and to ideas and blah blah blah. But actually, when you really look at it, you begin to see that that they're not married, that those thoughts come and go, the feelings come and go, and you can lose thoughts, lose memories, stop having particular feelings, but there's always this sense of being, this sense of aliveness, and this looking out, this knowing of this reality. That always stays, and it's free. You never had to pay for that. You never had to ask somebody for it. You never had to switch it on or off. You've never sort of had to ignite it or ask for more of it or be afraid that there's not enough of it. It's always been there. Experiencing has always been here, which is really beautiful. So this assumption of who you are isn't who you actually are.